I guess this is starting to become a theme on my channel, but once again, I mainly only utilize these 2 credit cards to help save me over $2,500 on my recent road trip up the East Coast, and I want to tell y'all all about it. And this time, not only did I just use these 2 cards to transfer my points out to their travel partners, but I actually utilized both the $50 annual hotel credit on my Chase Sapphire Preferred and the $300 annual travel credit on my Venture X through both the Chase Ultimate Rewards travel portal and the Capital One travel portal. So I'm really excited to share that experience with y'all as well. So it's not just all about travel partners, but also those domestic travel portal trips that you might be taking. Oh, and also I had a pretty major change in my travel schedule on the latter half of this trip, and that actually caused me to have to phone up Capital One Travel to see if they could give me a refund on a completely non-refundable room that I booked. And the outcome of that may actually be a bit different than you think. Taking a look at this whole redemption from a high level perspective, it included 4 different hotel bookings, 0 flight bookings, and a whole lot of driving. The general structure of what's to follow from here is that I'll be breaking down the cash to points value of each one of the hotels that I booked. That way we can get a final cent per point value for each hotel. And then after that, I'll be doing a combined cent per point calculation so we can see how I did. With all that being said, let's dive into the numbers. Now, the first stop of my entire road trip leaving from Austin, Texas was in New Orleans, Louisiana. Since I was only going to be there for 1 night, I just booked a pretty cheap Hyatt that was actually located in the French Quarter, basically downtown New Orleans. And it was pretty funny because this hotel actually literally ended up being on Bourbon Street, which I was not expecting. And I got there at like midnight on a Saturday, so just a terrible time to be pulling into New Orleans. But as for the booking itself, if I was to have booked this room in cash, it would have cost me $274. But if I wanted to book with Hyatt points instead, I only needed 15,000 Hyatt points. The way that I got my Hyatt points, of course, was by transferring my points from my Chase Sapphire Preferred over to Hyatt. And to get that final cent per point calculation, which I'll be doing for all of these hotels, we're going to be taking the total cash price of these hotel stays. And if you're doing this calculation, you'll also want to subtract any taxes and fees to get a true cent per point value. But considering I have so many hotels to get through, I'm just going to be taking the total cash price that I found on their website, and we'll be dividing that by the total amount of points that it would require to make that same booking, and then we'll multiply by 100 to get that into a cent per point form. So for this first booking, we'll be taking the $274, dividing that by 15,000 points, multiplying by 100, and that's going to give us a value of 1.82 cents per point. Now, this was just a 1-night stay on a random Saturday in New Orleans, so it wasn't like an elevated price or anything like that, but you can see here that this is a reason why Hyatt is so popular. I really didn't have to do any research and just booked a Hyatt in downtown New Orleans, and I got a very respectable earning rate for doing so. So after staying down there on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, the next day I made my way over to Hilton Head, South Carolina, which was a pretty long drive, but also a very pretty drive nonetheless. And the place that I would be staying in Hilton Head was called the Sonesta Resort. And at this hotel, I'd be staying there for 3 total nights. Granted, one of those nights was the night that I actually drove in, and I got there at like 10:30, so I didn't really get to stay too much time during the day there, but still 3 nights. If I was to have booked this room in cash for 3 nights, it would have cost me $809.83. And the way that I actually went about using points for this redemption is kind of interesting. Y'all know that I do speak pretty highly, honestly, of using your points through travel portals if you get a boost on your points. And while the Chase Sapphire Preferred only gives you a 25% boost through their travel portal, in some cases, it would actually make more sense to use the travel portal than transferring out, especially if you're staying at a place like this that is not associated with any travel partners at all. So the way that I booked this was through Chase's travel portal, again with my Chase Sapphire Preferred. And I also wanted to use my hotel credit that comes on the Chase Sapphire Preferred because that's just one that's honestly not that convenient to use normally. But in this case, it worked out perfectly and actually saved me $50. So the way that I made this booking was with 60,750 Chase points. And I chose to book with both points and cash that I could activate that $50 hotel credit. So I technically also paid with $50.45 in cash. However, that doesn't need to go into this calculation necessarily. I guess technically the 45 cents does, but we're not going to worry about that. But that's because I actually got to use the hotel credit, and that effectively lowered the amount of Chase points I needed to use to make this booking. So now if we go back to that cent per point formula, if you put the $809.83 in cash up top, we can divide that by 60,750 points, multiply that by 100, and that gives you a cent per point value of 1.33 cents per point. So as you can see, it should have been a 1.25 cent per point redemption, but since I used that that annual hotel credit, I actually got that bump to 1.33, just how the math works out. Now, Hilton Head was awesome, beautiful beaches there and everything, and the resort was actually really, really nice. But after 3 nights of being there, it was time for me to continue the journey, and I just continued it this time to Charleston, South Carolina, which wasn't too far away. Now, in Charleston, I wanted to stay at a pretty cool place because it's a very historic town. And for those of y'all that know my buddy Anthony Venture, who also makes great credit card content, one of the properties that he stays at a lot in Charleston is the Mills House. It's supposed to be one of those haunted hotels that's just very old and has a lot of history to it. But considering he spoke so highly of it, I figured that I wanted to give it a shot while in Charleston. So I booked a 2-night stay at the Mills House that would have cost me originally $753.88. And since this is a Hilton property, maybe you're thinking that I would use my Amex points to transfer out to Hilton and redeem that way. Or maybe you think I have some Hilton cards that I could use the points from for this booking. But I am not somebody that holds any Hilton cards at the moment. And even though you get a 1 Amex point to 2 Hilton point conversion rate with your Amex points, that redemption rate, if I remember correctly, was still under 1 cent per point for my Amex points. And that's obviously not acceptable for me. So what I did instead was actually use the Chase travel portal once again. That at least guaranteed me a 1.25 cent per point redemption rate. And considering this is the hotel that I wanted to stay at and I wasn't being very flexible, I was okay with taking just that small boost on my points. So the total amount of Chase points I ended up having to use was 60,310. Once again, if we run back that cent per point calculation, we should know what to expect here because I use the Chase travel portal with my Chase Sapphire Preferred. But if you take $753.88 over 60,310 Chase points, multiply by 100, you're going to get a cent per point rate of 1.25 cents per point, just as expected. The Mills House was awesome. Honestly, I really loved Charleston. I had a couple of my buddies come and meet me there too, so we just had a great couple of nights. And I definitely love to come back, and maybe one day I'll end up moving there for a bit, who knows. But in general, I had a ton of fun in Charleston and ended up having to continue my drive after 2 nights. But this is that part of my trip that took a bit of a turn like I was mentioning earlier. So I'm first going to tell you about the booking that I had actually made previously, that non-refundable room that I was mentioning, because originally I was fully planning on staying at this place. But what I ended up doing instead was going from Charleston to Savannah, Georgia, because that's where one of my buddies lived and I wanted to stay a couple of nights with him. And then after Savannah, Georgia, I went down to Pensacola Beach, Florida. So I still did get to stay in Florida on my road trip, but it wasn't exactly where I was originally planning to. But going back to that original booking, I was supposed to be going to Destin, Florida right after Charleston. And the place I was supposed to be staying was called the Henderson Beach Resort and Spa. Now this one kind of reminded me a lot of that Sonesta resort that I stayed in Hilton Head, at least from what I could see online, of course. And with that being said, just like the Sonesta resort, this place is not going to be a straight travel partner from any of the big lenders. So the only way to really book it would be in cash or through a travel portal. And I was thinking like, man, I don't want to have to use a travel portal again. And I don't honestly want to use any more of my Chase points. I've already used over 100,000 for this trip. But what I had not used this year was the annual travel credit on my Capital One Venture X. So that is what informed this whole entire booking for Destin. And let me tell you more about that. If I was to have booked this 2-night stay at the Henderson Beach Resort and Spa in cash, that would have cost me $745.17. But what I did instead was found this stay through Capital One's travel portal, and that only required me to use 44,517 Capital One miles on top of that $300 annual travel credit on my Venture X. So I did the exact same thing I did with the hotel credit on the Chase Sapphire Preferred, and I opted to pay for this booking partially in points and partially in cash so I could activate that travel credit. Do note that when I booked this trip, the Venture X's annual travel credit was still a statement credit, which has changed recently, but that was my experience with the travel credit this year, and we'll see how it changes next year. Honestly, it shouldn't really change anything besides the fact that I wouldn't have gotten any points for that booking, because for this day I did, since this was a statement credit, but next year I won't have that luxury. So going back to the math though, if we take that $745.17 cash booking and divide that by the 44,517 Capital One miles I had to use, again, I only had to use that little amount because I used a $300 annual travel credit on my Venture X. But if we divide those two numbers and multiply by 100, we're going to get a cent per point rate of 1.67 cents per point. Now, just for completeness sake, like I mentioned, instead of actually staying at this Destin property, I drove to Savannah, Georgia instead and stayed with my buddy obviously for free. And then from there, I still had like a 17-hour drive or something crazy to get all the way back home. So what I did instead was I drove like halfway to Pensacola Beach, Florida, and then I continued my trip from there the rest of the way the next day. But that 1-night stay at Pensacola Beach was just at a Hampton Inn property that actually turned out to be everything I needed. And instead of booking that place in points, I actually just decided to book it in cash, because in reality, there was no great redemption rate for this 1-night stay and it wasn't that expensive to begin with. I paid a total of $159.30 for that 1-night stay. That doesn't go into our calculations here today, obviously, because I didn't use points for that booking, but I wanted to just mention it in case y'all were curious where I I actually ended up staying. Honestly, I think that was my first time staying at a Hampton Inn, and I know they're more on the budget side of the hotel game, but they had fine amenities and the room was nice, and also it was right on the beach, so that was pretty cool. And for that small-ish price for the one night, I thought it was worth it. Editing me here, and I just realized I completely forgot to tell y'all about my experience with that Capital One Travel customer service agent. So to give y'all the quick rundown, like I mentioned before, I had originally booked a completely non-refundable stay at that Henderson beach resort and spa. So whenever I figured out that I actually couldn't make that trip, the first thing that I did was actually call the hotel themselves to let them know I wouldn't be there because I didn't want any like cancellation or no-show fees, I guess. And then the second thing I did was I went to Capital One's travel portal because I assumed that going through that I would be able to, at least tell them that I wouldn't make the trip. But actually it didn't even let me do that. It said since it was non-refundable, I didn't have to do anything. It just didn't matter either way. But I decided to still call their customer service department because I wanted to just see if they could possibly give me some money back. So whenever I called the Capital One travel number I found online, I got connected with a super helpful guy right off the bat. And I basically just had to explain to him why I canceled the trip. And after explaining that, he was being, again, super courteous and basically just told me that they had connections with that hotel specifically, and he could actually call them up on my behalf to try to get me some money back. After that part of the conversation, he decided to just not put me on hold, but actually call me back at a later time because there was no telling how long that hotel would take to, work this out. And then about 20 minutes later, he calls me and tells me that not only are they able to refund all of the like 45,000 points I used to book that trip, but they also completely refunded that $300 annual travel credit on my Capital One Venture X. So what this means is that through a like 10-minute phone call of me talking with this Capital One travel guy, I was able to recoup over $750 back in value. So as you can tell, I had a very good experience with Capital One Travel. They had no reason to give me any money back on a non-refundable room that I booked, but they worked with me and were able to do that. And maybe that's just because I went through my Venture X, and maybe their customer service is just different on the Capital One Travel side compared to their normal customer service. But maybe y'all should leave some data points down below too, because from my experience, I think Capital One Travel's customer service is honestly not bad. Hopefully me sharing that helps y'all out a little bit, but let's get back to the video. So now we've talked about all 4 of the hotels that I booked in points, and now we can do a combined cent per point calculation here. In order for me to have booked all of these hotel stays in cash, I would have had to pay a grand total of $2,582.71. But what I did to reduce the amount of cash that I had to spend and actually get that to zero is that I first used the $50 annual hotel credit on my Chase Sapphire Preferred, effectively bringing that cash price down. I also used the $300 annual travel credit on my Capital One Venture X, which once again brought that total price down. And then I used a total of 136,060 Chase points and 44,517 Capital One miles to book this entire trip. While that was a lot of points for me to have to use, this was for 8 total nights, so in reality, not that bad. Now, of course, there's a big opportunity cost for me using all of those points for these travel bookings rather than just cashing them out. And the way that that math works out is that if I was to take that 136,060 Chase points that I used at a 1 cent per point rate, which you can redeem your points for cashback for through Chase, that would be $1,360.60. And then Capital One miles are only worth half a cent per point in cashback form through my Venture X, which would have been worth $222.59 in cash. That's a grand total cash value of $1,583.19. And while I personally am not on Team Cashback and I would never redeem my Capital One miles for cashback especially, I just wanted to put those numbers out there because I think it's good to be transparent about the fact that we do have that opportunity cost there. But to get back to that cent per point formula, let's take that $2,582.71 in cash and divide that by 180,577 credit card points, multiply that by 100, and my average cent per point rate was 1.52 for this entire trip. Now, I wonder what your initial reactions are to that number because it's not staggering by any means, but I do think that this is a realistic look at what the majority of credit card users actually would get from their points. And it may be a wake-up call to me and probably others out there that we should maybe taper back our expectations of the value that we get from our points if you are somebody that's traveling domestically and more on a budget. At the same time, I could have taken those exact same amount of points and booked some international first class flights, and in that case I might have gotten an actual value of $10,000 to $20,000 for those points, but that's not actually fitting with my travel habits right now, although it might next year. So while I could have just not made this video and just like pretended like I got much better redemption rate than I did, I think this is the reality for a lot of people. Like I said before, this entire trip was made possible because the Chase Sapphire Preferred and Capital One Venture X allowed me to not only transfer my points out to their travel partners, but to also use the credits that come on these cards, as well as use their travel portals to to give me a decent redemption rate back. And if you don't have either of these credit cards yet and you're strongly considering them, as always, feel free to use the links down below in my description to learn more about these cards. And if you apply through that link, it directly supports me and the channel, so thank you so much in advance for doing so. Assuming you like this redemption style video, if you've made it to this point in the video, go ahead and check out this video next where I did a full breakdown of my Las Vegas redemption for the creator meetup that we had a month or so ago. And as always, Odin and I both want to say thank you guys so much for watching. If you did enjoy it, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, and we'll catch you guys next time.